we have Dr. Refiloe Lepere, who is a master storyteller, playwright, drama therapist, and facilitator. She possesses advanced skill sets as a writer, director, embodied learning practitioner, curriculum developer, and strategy advisor to multifunctional clients in global settings. Her work is a journey in various media, radio, video, performance, and social practice. She weaves history and statistics and personal narratives to address issues of social injustice, trauma, intersectional identities, and Black experiences. She's a Ford Foundation Fellow and Think Doctoral Fellow. Here we go. Your topic for today, Dr. Lepere, is Postcards, Bodily Preserves, a Rogue Archive in Practice. Dr. Refiloe Lepere.
Thank you so much, Prof. Lewis, and thank you everyone for coming. Yes, my name is Refiloe Lepere. I'm a playwright and a director and a drama therapist, and I'd like to take a moment to really thank the team and the staff at the Faculty of Arts and Design for organizing this really awesome moment for us to really think about our work and engage with each other's work. And it's really exciting, and really I'm appreciative of that. I'd also like to take a moment to do a dedication, because I believe in the work that we do. There's a lot of people who have influenced and have made our work so much more possible, and therefore to acknowledge them in our work and in our moments of this time that we have. So I'd like to take this moment to really dedicate my presentation to Prof. Kennedy Chinyoa, who had a really ingrained influence on my work, and to really acknowledge his presence with us as we are doing this wonderful program. So I'm going to talk about a play that I did called Postcards, Bodily Preserves as Rogue Archive in Practice. And the reason why is that a lot of the times when we think about the archive, mostly Black women don't exist in that archive, right? And our work and our thoughts have not been existing in those archives. So I have made a conscious choice of having to analyze my own work and to really think about how does my work function in the archive and as a practice of an archive. So Postcards, Bodily Preserve is a play that I wrote. It's an episodic play that explores how trauma and stories are stored in our bodies. In the play, a woman called Malieto is introduced to women she finds as body parts in her lover's house. She questions the reliability of the witnessing of these women's traumas, their experiences, and the faithfulness of their storytelling. She, together with the women, embody the different stories that they tell. And the recollection of stories about trauma does not happen in a clear and linear way in which we are used to thinking about memory and memory recalling. However, the happenings sometimes happen in a blink of an eye. It is also a very turbulent and ritualistic exploration of how we store memories in our bodies, how we preserve records, because there's something in them that defies understanding and that we want to grasp, the copious and the feverish. So the focus of the play is really around the choreography of the human body as it creates meanings, abstract and concrete. The play comes from a space, for me, of being trapped in this body, of being human, of being woman, of being Black, and noting all of those postcards, letters, and notes that life has left on my body. The play was first performed by myself, Refiloe Lepere, as a one-hander, and then later I expanded it into a three-hander with Faith Busika, Mamatli Takudi Nzuza, and choreographed with Lerato Skibadi. It draws heavily around orality and storytelling and rituals and humor, and it examines these bodily behaviors that are repeatable, our embodied activities, and how these bodily encounters change due to context, due to space, due to politics, due to time. And the women are presented in an exhibition-like form. And I use this exhibition concept because for me, exhibition really speaks to the idea of curation and speaks to the idea of archiving. And I use the concept of a postcard because postcards are really an archival process, but it is a very public process. So when you think of a postcard, it goes through a very public system, right? Through the mail system, which is very public, but at the same time, it's a very private experience because, excuse me, postcard goes to a particular person. And so therefore, even in our stories and that we tell these stories, they're very particular, but at the same time, they're very public. They're very personal, but at the same time, very public. So I think of postcards in that way. So in a way that I think about the work that Postcard Bodily Preserve does is that it's situated in a moment, and in a moment of thinking about women as these radical subjects, and in a way of thinking of women as these radical subjects that have holding history. The paper, it's part of, it's like a chapter in my thesis, but this part of this chapter of this thesis is really around this. I'm asserting a political ideology that the Black woman's body is an archival space. And long having consigned our bodies to the margins and in narratives of human progress, we're trying and reimagining and resituating ourselves as the center. I use the concept of archive quite deliberately because I use it in relation to the concept of art and colonial logic of plunder, theft, collection, arrangement, safekeeping, and display. And when we're thinking of the archive and curation, when we're thinking of these modes and methods of knowing and writing, and when we realize that the Western Cartesian knowledge of making is about authorial, plunder, collection, arrangement. So in my work, I'm thinking also to think and challenge this authorial custodianship and to bring back that custodianship back into the bodies of the people who created. I'm thinking back of bringing back that authorialness back to women, and therefore to linger a bit in the historic, but also to linger and imagine what is the people who are creating history now, that it's not necessarily just a pastness, but it's also a presentness. I use the term rogue archive as borrowed from Jacques Derrida, where he thinks about the archive as a space where new laws are created, where governing is made anew by the people who encounter the archive now. So when he's thinking of a new democratic archive, it's an archive that is made by people, and that these people take possession, they explore it, and they exploit it. Therefore, the figure of the archive becomes about not just preservation, but more importantly, becomes about a radical democracy. It is also to think through this traditional archive and question its own concept of preservation, the tools and the grammars of it, the assembling of this archive, and what remains illegible or unintelligible when we think of Black women's lives in the archive. I use Saidiya Hartman to think with me and think through this idea of archive. In her work in Scenes of Subjection, she describes the archive as a necessary evil. She advocates the reclamation of the archive material for contrary purposes, to make visible the violated body as human flesh that has been absented from dominant histories or problematically co-opted. She also does something else also. She says, for us, the archive is to read it. It's like entering a mortuary. It permits us to see this final viewing and allows us for a glimpse of a person. So in the play, the women, and I'm going to read just a bit before I kind of like close up, is the women in the play use humor to really think about themselves as storytellers and as a universal emotion, as a way of being and as a way of breathing with and together through time. The women use laughter as a behavioral and contagious way of thinking about how do we share stories but observe each other. They also use humor as a way of knowledge making and as a way of handling slippages that we are engaging with. They use language and humor to understand the fault lines of what's happening. So in the one piece, when at the start of it, Maliato shares a story about, I guess my time is going to be up now, but it shares a story of how her body remembers, right? So she talks about how her body, and I'll share this part where she talks about yes, so she says, so when I grew up, I expected to find a husband as loving and as selfless as my father. Instead, I found Tammy. Nothing wrong with Tammy. It's just that I always give Tammy 30-minute back rubs, which he always asks for. And he never gives me back rubs unless I beg, and then only then when he gives me a back rub for only 30 seconds. So last year I broke my arm, this one. It was in a cast. and it is my everyday arm. And despite this, I continued with Tammy's back rubs. The doctor warned me that if I continued using the muscles in my arm that way, I will permanently damage them and have unbearable shooting pains for the rest of my life. I told Tammy this, what the doctor said, and Tammy said, I wear na baby. Ooh, if you don't want to give me the back rubs, I'll understand. But I think when you're just lazy. No, it's not a bad thing. It's just that if you're lazy, you're lazy. And maybe I can ask somebody else to give me the back rubs if you don't want. Well, it doesn't mean that you don't care. It's just that maybe you don't care that I have back pain. So one day, after all of this, after a long time of rubbing his back, my arm was sore. The pains had started like the doctor said. And I said to him, you see, Tammy, it is your turn to rub me, to rub my hands. And for half an hour, he complained about it. Can't these back rubs, he squeaked. Can't these back rubs are what? My love, what must be happening? I explained that I love him, but I also wanted something in return. And then he told me, doesn't be, you're selfish. So I tried to be selfless, but the shooting pains continued. And I then continued massaging him and being selfless. And one day, the pains were way too much. So I just left the house and came here. So in this retelling, she cites Tammy and quotes him verbatim. The trick of humor she uses is the recognizability of the citation, that in every performance, there's an intelligibility that we use. We embed features of ourselves and previous performances. And in this way, the women find ways of using histories, aesthetics, traditions, memory, and culture to embed themselves in historical conventions. As a theatre maker, and just to close up, I think about gestures and bodily acts as means of making meaning. And more importantly, as a way of creating and reacting in our meaning making and understanding of humans, and most importantly, in situating Black women's agentic as agencies that claim their own gestures, they claim their own lives and claim their own stories. In closing, Maliato allows for us to recognize that what is unsayable, it's not always political, it's not always emotionally, but it is always having to deal with how our bodies remembers things. She recovers that actually, most times when we are trying to remember and think, our bodies are the first point of contact around the impossible of feeling and remembering. That this archive is often overwritten with our own histories, and most importantly, it is in this part that we can deny and afford ourselves a reconciliation with the past. Thank you so much, and yeah.
Wow, thanks, Dr. Lepere. It's always exciting to talk to you about your topic and about the work that you have created. I also want to thank you for acknowledging Prof. Chinyawa, and yes, I can hear him laughing and joining in our conversations from where he is. I'd like to, while I'm inviting the colleagues to raise their proverbial hand, their online hand, to ask Dr. Lepere a question, I'd like to just acknowledge that our DVC, Research, Innovation and Engagement, has joined us this afternoon. And we'd like to acknowledge Dr. Vati Papo Zampaka to our session today and the FAD Showcase, Research Showcase. Welcome, Dr. Vati.
Thank you.
And thank you. Would you like to say a few words to us, Doctor?
No. I don't want at all. I don't want to disrupt the program. Please continue. I'm here as an attendee. I just want to get to hear what everyone is saying. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vati. You are more than welcome. Okay, colleagues, back over to you. Any hands that are raised, ready to ask Dr. Lepere a question? I am always so intrigued about the private and public storytelling aspects, the private space, private place, and public, the storytelling. And we've had many discussions, Dr. Lepere, and about your work as space and the body. I want to ask a performative question, and I know I say that with tongue in cheek to you. I want to know from you what was the responses to the performances where you performed these? I know you did it as research, but what were the spectators, audience's responses to to the performances?
I mean, with this piece, the piece Postcards, there were varying types of responses because it goes into very traumatic storytelling. But it was a lot of what has happened, and which is part of the work that I then create around story circle playmaking, that the story gives rise to other stories. So what happens was other people then start telling their stories when in terms of response back to the play. So people have their own stories and familiar stories. And I love that idea that even while I was doing that, Letitia's able to say, look, this is linking to my work. So it's exactly the kind of response that people do when they hear the personal stories that are sitting in the bodies of somebody else. And then they see, that is my story. So I'm acknowledging that archive that is in you, that is also very private, but it's very public. Like that's why the concept of a postcard being very public, but very private, but it's about an experience that's quite public also. So that's why, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lepere, and I agree with Letitia in the comments that we would really like to see your work here. Give us another opportunity to see your work with the extended version with the the women performers. It would be fantastic. I'm going to wrap this up and move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Dr. Lepere. We are moving on to Dr. Pashkovich, Dr. Rosti Pashkovich, Dr. Rastlava